For those of us living in the modern world, travel is a convenience, a choice, and an expectation of comfort. We navigate by satellite, cross continents in hours, and rest assured that a clean bed and a hot meal are waiting for us at our destination. But strip away the asphalt, the GPS, the police forces, and the modern medicine, and you are left with the medieval reality, a world where every journey was not a vacation, but a desperate, life-altering gamble. Medieval people travelled not for leisure, but out of necessity. Trade was the lifeblood of the scattered kingdoms, forcing merchants to traverse dangerous routes, often carrying their entire fortune on their backs or in small, vulnerable caravans. Pilgrimage offered spiritual salvation, compelling the pious to walk hundreds of miles to holy sites, often in severe physical distress. Military campaigns required vast movements of men and supplies, while administrative duties called nobles and officials away from their protected strongholds. And, tragically, simple survival drove others, forcing families to seek refuge from war, famine, or persecution. This was not a safe era. Medieval travel was genuinely dangerous and often life-threatening. The most crucial reality was the sheer lack of organized infrastructure. There were no guaranteed inns or post houses, no clear, well-maintained highway system, and no central authority ensuring safe passage. A traveller could easily find themselves isolated, miles from any recognizable settlement, reliant solely on their wits and luck. This era was defined by isolation. The world beyond the village wall was a vast, unknowable, and hostile expanse. The experience of the journey was also dictated by the traveller's social standing. A wealthy noble, travelling with an armed retinue and utilising letters of credit, faced a vastly different set of challenges than a lone peasant pilgrim or a travelling artisan. For the wealthy, the risks were primarily kidnapping or large-scale ambush. For the commoner, it was immediate starvation, exposure, or a chance encounter with a desperate bandit. Even at its fastest, travel demanded a significant commitment of time. On foot, a typical pace averaged only 20 to 30 miles per day, dependent entirely on terrain and weather. A traveller on horseback might cover 40 to 50 miles. To cross a region the size of France could take weeks, and a journey across Europe could easily consume months, if not half a year. That commitment of time represented months away from home, months of exposure, and months of dread. This is the framework we will follow. The nightmares of the medieval road were not supernatural, they were terrifyingly real. Before a medieval traveller even took their first step, they faced the agonizing question of what to carry. Every pound mattered, yet every omission could mean disaster. The luggage of a traveller was a desperate, heavy arsenal of necessity, designed less for comfort and more for sheer, brutal survival against an indifferent world. What travellers carried, the most critical goods were the essentials of life: food and water. Food consisted mostly of items that wouldn't immediately spoil: dried bread or hardtack, aged cheese, and heavily salted or smoked meat. These provisions, however, were notoriously heavy and often went rancid long before the journey was complete. Water was carried in leather or wooden containers, though securing a safe refill was a constant gnawing anxiety, which we will explore shortly. For protection, a traveller needed to be their own defence. Weapons ranged from the noble's finely crafted sword or mail shirt to the commoner's sturdy iron-tipped walking staff or dagger. Carrying money was equally dangerous. Coins were usually hidden in multiple separate locations, sewn into clothing linings, stored in hidden pockets, or tucked inside religious items, a desperate attempt to mitigate total loss during a robbery. Wealthier merchants often carried letters of credit, a necessity to avoid transporting huge caches of gold, though these were only redeemable in large, secure cities. Clothing was an absolute misery. Travellers relied on heavy wool, linen tunics, and thick cloaks, layers designed for warmth and protection against rain and thorns. Yet, once soaked, wool took days to dry, leading to constant chilling and skin irritation. The traveller's appearance deteriorated rapidly. Footwear was perhaps the most crucial and vulnerable item. Worn leather shoes, no matter how well made, broke down quickly against the unforgiving terrain of stone, mud, and uneven forest paths, leading to crippling foot pain and open wounds that were a gateway for infection. The physical reality of this burden was immense. The weight of supplies, the heavy clothing, and the weapons made movement laborious. Travellers rarely bathed. Opportunities were few and far between, and the risk of hypothermia or of lingering in a vulnerable state often outweighed the desire for cleanliness. As journeys stretched into weeks, the dirt, grime, and sweat accumulated, leading to skin afflictions, body lice, and a general deterioration of health. It was a vicious cycle. The longer the journey, the heavier the physical burden, and the more vulnerable the traveller became. The vast, empty landscape offered little in the way of proper maintained roads, leaving the traveller to slog through mud, over rocks and across fields, all the while carrying their heavy life support system on their aching back. In the medieval world, travel meant a forced intimacy with disease. While violence and exposure claimed lives, illness, often silent and invisible, was the single greatest threat to the traveller's survival. The road was not merely an inconvenience, it was a vector for plague and poison. The primary culprit was often the most fundamental human need: water. Waterborne diseases, dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, were endemic. Rivers and wells near settlements were notoriously unreliable, contaminated by human and animal waste. The traveller's choice was brutal: risk immediate, severe dehydration or risk a debilitating or fatal infection. This constant, unavoidable contamination forced many travellers to rely on weak beer or wine. The fermentation process, though medieval people did not understand the microbiology, made these drinks safer than raw water. Yet even this provided no true guarantee. Suffering severe dehydration in a remote area, perhaps miles from even a dubious water source, was a common, agonizing end for the solitary traveller. Even minor injuries became life-threatening. A simple cut, a scrape from a fall, or a blister from a new shoe could quickly lead to a crippling infection. Without knowledge of sterilization or access to effective antimicrobial agents, a traveller's immune system was often overwhelmed. Gangrene, the death of tissue, was an ever-present fear, forcing the desperate traveller or their companions to resort to crude, agonizing field amputations. Medieval remedies were pitifully inadequate: poultices of questionable herbs, or worse, the harmful practice of bloodletting. The lack of antibiotics meant that even a tiny laceration incurred while collecting firewood could be a death sentence, transforming a manageable journey into a final, harrowing ordeal. And then there was the larger, terrifying threat of contagion. The great pandemics, especially the Black Death, travelled precisely along the merchant and pilgrim routes. A safe passage could become a journey through a newly contaminated zone in days. As travellers moved from town to town, they carried the plague, often unknowingly. Some cities attempted quarantine measures, often trapping travellers outside the city walls, leaving them exposed and starving, uncertain if the illness was on the road they had just travelled, or waiting in the closed gates ahead. The psychological terror of this invisible threat, not knowing if you were already infected, not knowing who among your companions would be next, was itself a form of mental torture. Compounding all this was nutritional deficiency. The diet on long journeys was limited, monotonous, and lacked fresh produce, fruits, or dairy. Scurvy, anemia, and weakened immune systems were the inevitable result. Poor nutrition made travellers highly vulnerable, turning every encountered illness or pathogen into a potentially fatal encounter. The irony was devastating. A traveller could be starving and desperately weakened, even while traversing populous, fertile lands, simply because they lacked the means or the time to safely secure and prepare a balanced meal. The body of the medieval traveller was a slowly deteriorating machine, subjected to constant, unrelenting physical stress. The cumulative toll of days, weeks, and months on the road was often more insidious and destructive than any single act of violence. One of the most persistent and dangerous burdens was sleep deprivation. Finding a safe, secure place to sleep was a nightly challenge, leading to fear-induced insomnia. Travellers rarely, if ever, felt truly safe in unfamiliar or exposed environments. This was the true source of the nightmares referenced in the title, not monsters, but the real anxiety, hypervigilance, and cumulative stress that prevented restorative rest. Poor sleep quality led to slower reactions, poor judgment, and increased vulnerability. In extreme cases, exhaustion itself became a hazard, bordering on delirium, where the traveller might suffer hallucinations or make critical, fatal errors in navigation or vigilance. The constant walking led to inevitable injury and joint damage. Worn leather shoes offered minimal protection against uneven, rock-strewn terrain, resulting in constant, agonizing foot pain and debilitating blisters. Over years of travel, the stress led to permanent joint deterioration. Older travellers, already suffering from arthritis and previous poorly healed injuries, found the road a punishing gauntlet. Every small, unhealed injury, every persistent ache, accumulated until the traveller was a tapestry of pain and fatigue. The environmental toll added further degradation. The sun caused severe sunburn and chapping, while the wind constantly battered exposed skin. In northern regions, frostbite and hypothermia were a regular threat, turning the slightest misstep into death from exposure. Conversely, southern routes could bring severe heat exhaustion. A constant, draining reality was that travellers often arrived at their destinations looking years, even decades, older than they actually were, their bodies bearing the indelible marks of their harrowing transit. The physical breakdown was a slow, painful countdown to complete incapacity. The threat of violence was immediate and ever-present. For the medieval traveller, the risk of encountering bandits was not a matter of folklore, but an organised, calculated reality. The criminal underworld preyed directly upon the essential movement of goods and people. Banditry was often an organised industry. Remote stretches of road were notorious, places where entire groups of travellers, including their goods and horses, could simply vanish. These were not always simple, desperate thieves. Sometimes they were highly organised gangs, occasionally comprised of former soldiers or mercenaries whose trade skills had turned to organised crime. The traveller was an easy, isolated target, carrying valuable and portable goods, far from any meaningful assistance or legal recourse. The threats came in several forms. The most visible were the organised bandit groups, but there were also desperate local populations who, faced with famine or poverty, would prey on the rich influx of travellers. Perhaps most insidious were the corrupt local officials or minor nobles who would enable or even actively participate in the theft on their own lands, knowing the centralised law enforcement of the era was practically non-existent. There were no police, no highway patrol, and often no consequence for crimes committed far from major population centres. The methods of these robbers were brutal and effective. Travellers were often robbed of everything: money, clothing, horses and goods, stripped down to the bare necessities, making starvation a near certainty. Those who resisted were frequently murdered on the spot, and witnesses were often eliminated. Women travellers faced additional, targeted sexual violence, compounding the horror of the robbery. The road was lined with dark stories, many of them true, of travellers left for dead or dying on the roadsides. The psychological impact was immense. The traveller was forced into a constant state of hypervigilance. They never knew who to trust: the seemingly kind farmer, the fellow traveller, or even the innkeeper. This deep-seated distrust and paranoia meant true relaxation was impossible. The trauma of surviving or witnessing an attack, or even the constant fear of one, fundamentally altered a traveller's decision-making process, forcing them to take longer, more difficult routes, and to travel at inconvenient, dangerous times. Economically, the stakes were astronomical. For a merchant, the loss of an entire journey's profit to bandits could mean financial ruin lasting years. This overwhelming risk drove the evolution of early insurance-like systems, compelling travellers to hire expensive armed guards or to join larger, more manageable caravans for collective protection. In addition to the threat of organised crime, the medieval traveller was perpetually caught in the shifting currents of political and military conflict. The roads they relied on were often lines of engagement between warring factions, turning a simple trade route into an active battlefield. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of territories controlled by feuding nobles, rival kings, and independent city-states. Travellers often had to pass through active combat zones, risking being killed as simple collateral damage. The unpredictability was the greatest hazard. A route considered safe one month could be a war zone the next, and information travelled slowly, if at all. A merchant might set off only to learn too late that war had broken out on the other side of a mountain range, forcing a catastrophic and time-consuming rerouting. Worse than the battle itself was often the presence of soldiers. Armies on the march were notorious for commandeering supplies from travellers, demanding food, horses, and money in the name of their lord. Mercenary bands and undisciplined unpaid soldiers were often a threat indistinguishable from bandits, engaging in routine robbery and violence against vulnerable people. The line between a legitimate army and a criminal gang was often blurred, with soldiers feeling emboldened by their weapons and lack of accountability. They inflicted not only theft and damage, but also sexual violence against women and children in their path. Consequently, travellers were routinely forced to take significantly longer, more dangerous detours to avoid known conflict areas. This added weeks to a journey, consumed vital provisions, and increased the risk of environmental exposure. A traveller's route was constantly dictated by the political landscape, a dangerous and fluid map of shifting allegiances and active aggression. Navigating the medieval world meant navigating its complex, often violent politics. In the face of human threats, the medieval traveller also had to contend with the indifferent and overwhelming power of nature. Without modern weather prediction, nature was a constant and often lethal surprise. Sudden storms and flooding were catastrophic. A heavy rain could quickly swell a gentle stream into a raging torrent, destroying makeshift bridges and rendering roads impassable. Travellers were frequently swept away while crossing fords, or found themselves trapped by rising water. In open fields, lightning strikes were a danger, compounded by the fact that travellers often huddled under trees for shelter, unknowingly increasing their risk. Hailstorms, sometimes with stones large enough to cause serious injury, could strike suddenly. Winter travel transformed the journey into a fight against the elements themselves. Many routes, particularly high-altitude passes, became entirely impassable from late autumn to early spring. For those who could not wait, the desperate refugee, the merchant with a critical shipment, the risks were extreme. Frostbite, hypothermia, and death from exposure were common ends, with travellers often found frozen to death in mountain passes, their bodies covered by snow. The dramatically short daylight hours also meant more time travelling in darkness, further increasing the risk of falls, getting lost, and encountering danger. The terrain itself was a hazard. Narrow mountain passes presented the risk of falls, rock slides, and avalanches. Forests, vast and unmarked, were a labyrinth where travellers, without maps or clear markers, could easily become hopelessly lost. The reality of spending nights lost and exposed to the elements and predators meant that many travellers simply vanished, their fate forever unknown, consumed by the sheer scale of the wilderness. Finally, there was the threat of animals. Wolves in packs, particularly during harsh winters, were a significant danger, sometimes preying on livestock or isolated travellers. Bears, wild boars, and even farm animals could pose a threat. Yet, perhaps the most persistent animal threat came from insects. Lice, fleas, and ticks spread disease and caused relentless discomfort, compounding the traveller's suffering and contributing to the spread of plague and typhus. In warmer regions, snake bites were lethal, with no antivenom available to save the victim. If modern travel is defined by precise navigation, medieval travel was defined by chronic disorientation. The simple act of knowing where you were and where you were going was one of the most difficult and frustrating challenges. Navigation methods were primitive. Accurate scaled maps were virtually non-existent for the common person. Any maps that did exist were often wildly inaccurate and focused more on theological or symbolic representation than geographical reality. The traveller relied entirely on landmarks, the position of the sun, and the highly unreliable word-of-mouth directions from locales. However, most medieval people rarely travelled far from their homes, and their local knowledge did not extend to distant towns or difficult routes. The common problems were numerous and maddening. Wrong turns were frequent, leading travellers miles off course to completely wrong destinations or to paths that ended abruptly in impassable terrain. Journeys constantly took far longer than anticipated, exhausting provisions and pushing the traveller to the brink of despair. There were no mile markers, no road signs, and no clear junctions. A road was often just a worn path that could disappear into a field or forest. Travellers often wasted days retracing their steps, consuming vital energy and resources. The psychological toll of uncertainty, never being truly sure of your location, was a draining anxiety. The use of guides was a common but risky necessity. A good guide was invaluable. A bad one could be disastrous. Travellers risked hiring guides who were not only unreliable or incompetent, but, in the worst cases, were actively working with bandits to lead their charges into carefully planned traps. The traveller was forced to guess if their guide was a protector or a predator. Furthermore, a guide might simply abandon a traveller in difficult or dangerous territory if the money ran out or the route became too perilous for their own comfort. The road was a place where trust was a luxury few could afford. Beyond the physical dangers of bandits and disease lay the profound psychological toll of medieval travel, the unrelenting weight of isolation and loneliness. To travel was to completely detach from the anchor of society. For weeks or even months, travellers lost all meaningful connection to their communities. There was no communication with family, no letters, no news from business partners. The uncertainty about home, the fear that a loved one had fallen ill, that a business had failed, or that circumstances had drastically changed in their absence, was a constant, corrosive worry. For solo travellers, there could be days or weeks without any meaningful human interaction, driving deep feelings of separation and melancholy. This profound isolation, coupled with sleep deprivation and constant danger, fueled a pervasive state of paranoia and distrust. Every stranger encountered required an immediate, high-stakes assessment of their intentions. Was this person a potential source of help or a deadly threat? The lack of restful sleep only intensified this paranoia, magnifying minor concerns into genuine fear and making the traveller more susceptible to stress-induced hallucinations that often made the real fears seem supernatural. The mental health impact was severe, with depression, anxiety, and the psychological effects of constantly being afraid becoming a defining feature of the long-term traveller. Many arrived at their destinations psychologically changed and often traumatized, deciding never to undertake such a harrowing experience again. The dangers of the road were not equally distributed. The traveller's position within the medieval social hierarchy dramatically influenced the threats they faced and the resources they could summon for defense. For some, the road was merely difficult. For others, it was an immediate threat to life and dignity. Women travelers faced an extreme vulnerability, particularly if they were unaccompanied. While some women, like pilgrims or merchants, traveled out of necessity, they were at high risk of sexual assault and violence in addition to robbery. The very assumption that an unaccompanied woman was a vulnerable target made them magnets for opportunistic criminals. Their capacity for recourse if attacked was severely limited, often forcing them to travel with paid protection or to forego necessary journeys altogether. Poor travellers, beggars, mendicant friars, and poor pilgrims had the fewest resources and faced the highest degree of danger. They were less likely to be robbed of material wealth, but were more likely to be robbed of the few possessions they had. They were also the most vulnerable to starvation and exposure, with limited access to secure shelter or assistance from the wealthy. Consequently, they experienced the highest mortality rates on the road. Even among the wealthy, the risks differed. Merchants were targets specifically because of the goods and money they carried, leading to calculated large-scale ambushes. Nobility, while better protected, faced the risk of kidnapping for ransom, a high-stakes, politically motivated crime. Yet it was the nobility who had the means to hire professional armed guards, procure better equipment, and secure reliable intelligence on safe routes, mitigating their risk significantly compared to the common traveller. Finally, the traveller faced discrimination by region or belief. The medieval world was intensely insular. Travellers from different areas might face prejudice, aggression, or suspicion purely because of their origin or accent. Religious minorities, such as Jewish merchants, often faced additional risks in certain territories, where religious intolerance made them targets for robbery and persecution. At the end of a long, miserable day, the traveller craved only one thing: rest. Yet the places of shelter, when they could be found, were often almost as dangerous as the road itself. Inns and hostels were few and far between on most minor routes. In the places they did exist, they were often filthy, overcrowded, and disease-ridden. Travellers were forced into bed sharing, often with complete strangers, including known criminals, which led to constant theft and the rapid transmission of disease. Infestations of lice, fleas, and bedbugs were unavoidable. Furthermore, food poisoning from poorly stored and prepared food was a regular hazard, turning a night's rest into another source of debilitating illness. For most nights, travellers were forced to sleep rough, either in forests or open fields, making them profoundly vulnerable to animal attacks, bandits, and the elements. Under such conditions, true rest was impossible. The need for constant vigilance meant that genuine restorative sleep was a rarity, and the fear itself often made the situation feel worse than it was, compounding the psychological damage from previous scenes. Religious shelters offered some relief. Monasteries, abbeys, and churches sometimes provided hospitality to pilgrims and travellers, but this came with expectations, either of payment, labour, or at the very least, a strict adherence to religious conduct. Their capacity was always limited, meaning countless travellers were turned away, forced back out into the cold. Not all religious communities were welcoming, and some were simply too poor to offer assistance. The cumulative effect of poor accommodation was a perpetual state of fatigue. Never getting a proper, secure night's rest accumulated over weeks and months, and this sleep deprivation alone became life-threatening, eroding judgment and resilience. Travellers often arrived at their destinations not merely tired, but in states of severe, debilitating exhaustion. The dangers and hardships we have documented are not speculation. They are confirmed by the limited but telling evidence we have from the era. Historical records, from travel diaries, merchants' letters, and pilgrimage accounts, describe a reality of genuine, protracted suffering. We know from these primary sources that mortality rates for medieval travellers were surprisingly high. Many merchants and pilgrims never completed their journeys, succumbing to illness, accident, or violence. Pilgrimage accounts are filled with narratives detailing debilitating illness, severe injury, and the death of travelling companions. Even military campaign records often document that losses to disease and accidents far outweighed losses in combat, highlighting the lethal nature of the journey itself. This extreme risk profoundly affected the medieval economy. Travel was so dangerous and expensive that it acted as a severe restraint on trade. The costs associated with hired protection, replacing lost goods, and the inevitable delays made travel a luxury, which in turn made goods expensive and rare. This economic reality drove the development of merchant guilds, which were created partly to organize safer collective travel and provide shared protection. Early insurance-like systems began to evolve as a desperate attempt to mitigate the financial ruin that a single bandit attack could cause. So, why did people still travel? For many, the answer was stark: necessity. For merchants, it was economic survival. For pilgrims, it was religious obligation and spiritual hope. For others, it was political duty or sheer desperation, fleeing famine or war. Medieval people understood that despite the risks, travel was sometimes simply unavoidable. In time, medieval society slowly began to adapt. The need for safety led to the organization of safer routes and travel groups. The role of monasteries as way stations became formalized. Over centuries, customs and basic road systems were developed and protected, slowly making the act of travel more survivable. This slow, painful evolution was a direct response to the horrors of the medieval road. The journey of even a few hundred miles in the medieval era was a significant and genuinely dangerous undertaking. What we consider routine, a short trip between cities, was, for them, a major life event, a decision that could literally be a risk-your-life proposition. Those who survived often arrived bearing real trauma, physical damage, and the profound psychological impact of their ordeal. This understanding forces us to redefine the nightmares of the medieval traveller. They were not phantoms or ghouls of legend, but the terrifyingly real presence of disease, violence, starvation, and exposure. The cumulative mental effects, the sleep deprivation, the stress, the fear-induced hallucinations, transformed these tangible threats into a lasting, debilitating psychological state. The legacy of these struggles is all around us. The eventual improvement of roads, the standardization of inns, and the slow development of centralized law enforcement represent profound, fundamental progress. These improvements were directly shaped by the experiences of medieval travelers who undertook their harrowing journeys. They forced society to organize itself and to build the infrastructure of civilization. Today's travelers have virtually no conception of how dangerous and utterly difficult travel once was. Our ease of movement, our safety nets, and our access to instant communication are historically unique. We owe a debt of respect to the medieval merchant, the pilgrim, and the soldier who, in an era without safety nets, displayed an extraordinary resilience and courage, traveling anyway because life demanded it. The reality is that for much of history, travel could kill you. The medieval traveler faced genuine nightmares, not supernatural ones, but hard, brutal suffering, and their collective experiences shaped the path toward the safer, more connected world we inhabit today. Final reflection: the quiet safety of our modern route is built on the harrowing, unwritten history of the medieval road. It was their stories and experiences which generated the improvements we take for granted today. The next time you take a safe, pleasant trip to a destination where the trip itself is a luxury, spare a thought for those medieval forebears who once had a much harder time of it than we will ever know.